Moving into a new home should have been a fresh start. The neighborhood appeared perfect at first glance: manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. I had dreamed of this day for years, finally stepping into a house that I could call my own. Little did I know, the dream would quickly spiral into a nightmare. The first week was blissful. I unpacked boxes, hung pictures, and started to familiarize myself with the layout of the house. Every room was a blank canvas, every corner a place to make my own. I waved at a few neighbors who were out tending to their lawns, trying to soak in the sense of community. Everything seemed normal until I noticed her. She was the quintessential Karen next door. Always impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed hair, and eyes that seemed to scan everything and everyone, like a hawk on patrol. She smiled politely when I first waved, but there was something in her stare, a piercing scrutiny that made my skin crawl. At first, I brushed it off. People have their quirks, I told myself. But within days, the quirks began to manifest in ways that could only be described as obsessive and controlling. I started receiving notices from the HOA, emails and letters that cited violations I didn't even know existed. Grass height exceeds 6 inches, one notice read. Another insisted my mailbox was improperly aligned. Every day brought a new complaint, each more absurd than the last. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. I noticed her standing by the street one morning, peering over her perfectly trimmed hedge as if counting blades of grass. She filed complaints with surgical precision, targeting every minor imperfection. My first instinct was to comply, to trim the grass, fix the mailbox, and ensure every rule was followed to avoid unnecessary conflict. But no matter what I did, the notices kept coming. It became clear she wasn't concerned about the HOA's rules, she was targeting me. The tension escalated quickly. I started noticing small acts of sabotage. A bag of fertilizer dumped carelessly on my lawn, a garden gnome knocked over and left on its side, strange footprints in the flower beds. Every morning brought evidence that someone was watching, waiting for a moment to strike. The fear of what she might do next began to creep in. Friends advised caution, neighbors whispered about her reputation. This wasn't just about rules, it was personal. The worst moment came when the HOA sent a notice indicating that several complaints against me had reached a point where eviction proceedings were being considered. The language was formal, yet the threat was crystal clear. Non-compliance with community regulations may result in legal action, including potential eviction, it read. I couldn't believe it. I had spent my life working to own a home, and now the idea of being forced out over petty grievances felt surreal. It was at this point I realized I had two choices: back down and let her win, surrendering to her relentless harassment, or fight back. And fight back I would. But I knew it couldn't be done recklessly. This woman thrived on control and intimidation. Any overt reaction would only escalate her attacks. I needed a plan, a strategy that would turn the tables without making me the aggressor in the eyes of the HOA. I began quietly documenting everything. Every complaint, every strange occurrence, every interaction. I started installing security cameras not just for protection, but to gather evidence. The more I watched, the more I noticed patterns, her timing, her methods, the subtle ways she manipulated the HOA. She had underestimated me. And for the first time since I moved in, I felt a sense of determination, a glimmer of hope that I could reclaim my peace. The battle had only just begun. What I didn't know was that once she realized I was no longer intimidated, the war would escalate in ways I never could have imagined. Every move I made, she would respond, each one more extreme than the last. And in the quiet of my living room, I vowed that I wouldn't let her drive me out of my own home. The stage was set, the players identified, and the first sparks of a neighborhood war had begun. What happened next would change not only my life but the entire street. The next few days were a mix of vigilance and quiet strategy. I refused to let fear dictate my actions, but I couldn't ignore the reality. This woman was relentless. Every morning, I would check the security footage from the night before, scanning for any suspicious movement near my property. The cameras captured subtle things at first: shadows lingering near the fence, the faint sound of a hedge trimmer when no one should have been around. Then it escalated. I caught her on camera walking along my driveway late at night, carefully measuring the height of my plants with a tape measure, peering over the gate as if judging every leaf. The intensity of her obsession became clear. This wasn't just about rules, it was personal. I realized she had a deep understanding of the HOA's procedures. Every complaint she filed followed a pattern, exploiting loopholes that most residents wouldn't even notice. It was as if she had spent years studying the bylaws, memorizing every clause, and learning exactly how to manipulate the system. But the more I watched her tactics, the more I recognized opportunities to fight back, not aggressively, but cleverly. Evidence was my weapon. Every minor harassment, every invasive act, I documented meticulously. The camera footage, photographs of damage, and records of HOA interactions became my arsenal. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself began to take notice. Casual greetings from other neighbors were tinged with tension, whispers in driveways hinted at long-standing issues with her, and some even subtly warned me that once she targeted someone, she didn't stop. But there were also unexpected allies. A few residents discreetly shared their own horror stories of petty complaints and fines, revealing patterns that mirrored my experience. Slowly, a small network of people who had endured her control formed, a silent, watchful group waiting for the day someone would finally push back. The HOA, meanwhile, continued to send notices, their tone increasingly formal and threatening. I responded to each one meticulously, never allowing emotion to cloud the documentation. I learned to phrase my replies with precision, citing rules accurately, referencing prior complaints, and maintaining a calm, professional tone. It was exhausting, but necessary. Each submission was a subtle assertion. I was aware of the harassment, I had proof, and I would not be bullied into submission. As the days passed, her tactics grew more audacious. One morning, I discovered my garden lights had been tampered with, wires cut, bulbs smashed, landscaping disturbed. The camera revealed her crouching behind a bush, crouched low with careful precision, ensuring she wasn't visible from the street. She was escalating. But instead of panicking, I began to see a pattern in her behavior. She thrived on control and visibility. By remaining calm and strategically documenting everything, I could neutralize her power. It wasn't just about protection anymore, it became a game of strategy. I started adjusting my routines deliberately, taking walks at unpredictable times, planting small decoys in the yard to see if she would react, testing her predictability. The satisfaction of anticipating her moves without confrontation gave me a sense of control I had never felt before. She expected fear, submission, compliance. Instead, she encountered observation, resistance, and quiet defiance. Yet, even with all precautions, the stress weighed heavily. Every rustle of leaves or sound of a passing car triggered an anxious glance toward the cameras. Sleep became restless, thoughts constantly returning to how far she might go next. But amidst the tension, a plan began to form, not a plan born of anger, but of calculated justice. The realization hit me clearly: if she wanted a war, I would give her one, but on my terms. Not with noise or drama, but with clever, undeniable countermeasures that could not be ignored. By the end of the week, it became clear that the battle lines were drawn. Her complaints were no longer subtle, she was trying to force eviction, and the HOA's rigid structure made her feel empowered. But she underestimated the power of preparation and evidence. I had transformed my fear into focus, and the quiet, meticulous work I had done over the past days was about to pay off. The next move would set everything in motion. The calm before the storm was over. What followed would escalate beyond petty complaints and late-night surveillance. It would become a neighborhood spectacle, a battle of wits and strategy that neither she nor the HOA could ignore. The neighborhood had transformed from a quiet, picturesque community into a tense battleground. Every movement in my yard, every minor detail, was now a potential trigger in this unspoken war. I had reached a point where I could anticipate her next moves, and with the evidence I had gathered, I felt a surge of confidence. But confidence alone wasn't enough. I needed to take action. It was time to turn the tables. I began with small, strategic moves. I made subtle adjustments to my property that were technically within HOA rules but designed to test her reactions. A few flower pots were slightly misaligned. A small patch of grass intentionally left taller than regulations dictated. Nothing extreme, nothing overt. Just enough to see how quickly she would notice, and more importantly, how far she was willing to escalate. Within hours, the complaints began to pour in. She had fallen into my trap, reacting precisely as I had anticipated. Every complaint was a confirmation that my plan was working. At the same time, I increased my documentation efforts. The cameras were no longer just monitoring, they were recording evidence of her obsession and harassment. I captured her pacing along the fence late at night, taking photos of my mailbox, and even peering into my windows. The footage revealed her increasingly erratic behavior. Her obsession was becoming almost comical in its intensity. I compiled everything into a detailed timeline, ready to present to the HOA when the time came. But I didn't stop there. I started gathering information about past residents who had clashed with her, quietly reaching out to those who had previously experienced her relentless complaints. Stories poured in. Fines for trivial matters, threats of eviction, personal grudges disguised as HOA enforcement. Each account reinforced what I already knew. This wasn't just about rules, it was about control and intimidation. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. Others had suffered in silence, and together, our collective experience could wield real influence. The psychological warfare began to escalate. I started subtle tactics to unsettle her, without breaking any rules. Garden lights would flicker at odd hours, small trinkets mysteriously appeared in her yard, and carefully placed reflections in windows hinted that someone was watching. It wasn't malicious, at least not physically, but it was enough to make her doubt her sense of control. She had thrived on fear and submission. By maintaining calm and observation, I disrupted her power. She was no longer the one dictating the pace of events. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to send notices, each one more severe than the last. But now I had an arsenal of evidence ready. Every complaint she filed, every minor sabotage captured on camera, every witness statement from other neighbors was meticulously organized. I drafted formal responses, citing exact bylaws, providing timestamps, and exposing her repeated harassment. Each submission undermined her credibility, making it clear that her vendetta was personal, not procedural. The turning point came unexpectedly. One morning, I received a notice that she had escalated her efforts, claiming multiple violations simultaneously and threatening legal action. But instead of fear, I felt anticipation. I knew this was the moment where careful planning would pay off. Using the documentation I had compiled, I filed a detailed counter-report to the HOA, presenting an undeniable record of harassment and obsessive behavior. I didn't just defend myself. I exposed her actions in a way that left the HOA with little choice but to investigate her conduct. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had begun to notice the tension between us. Whispers of the feud reached other residents, and the once quiet street became a place where subtle glances and quiet conversations hinted at a larger drama unfolding. She, confident in her perceived power, had no idea that the tide was turning. The very tools she had wielded to control and intimidate were now being used against her. The stage was set for the next phase. What had started as petty complaints and minor harassment was about to escalate into something far more public and undeniable. My careful preparation and observation had created the perfect leverage, and the moment to act was approaching. The quiet war that had been brewing for weeks was about to erupt into something the neighborhood couldn't ignore. After carefully documenting every act of harassment, every petty complaint, and every invasive move she had made, I was ready to escalate. Not with chaos, but with strategy, an undeniable counterattack that would shift the balance of power. I started by presenting my evidence to the HOA. Every complaint she had filed, every late-night surveillance video, every piece of property damage was compiled into a detailed, chronological record. I highlighted patterns of obsession, illustrating how her actions went far beyond reasonable enforcement of community rules. The HOA could no longer treat her as just another concerned neighbor, they had to see the truth. Her credibility was crumbling under the weight of objective documentation. At the same time, subtle psychological tactics continued. I deliberately rearranged small elements of my yard, slightly shifting garden decorations, placing harmless decoys near her line of sight, leaving subtle signs that indicated someone was watching. Each move was calculated to unsettle her, to make her obsess further while remaining technically within HOA rules. Every twitch, every reaction, every frantic complaint she filed only added to the mountain of evidence I was building. Then came the breakthrough. The HOA called a formal meeting to review the complaints. I attended with my compiled evidence, remaining calm, professional, and collected. They listened intently as I presented each incident, showing timestamps, video footage, and documented patterns. The shift in their demeanor was noticeable. For the first time, the HOA wasn't focusing on my supposed violations, they were scrutinizing her behavior. It was a quiet, almost satisfying reversal. Meanwhile, her confidence began to crumble. I noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Less frequent smiles when passing by, more anxious glances toward my property, hurriedly filing complaints that were increasingly baseless. Her carefully constructed image of control was unraveling, and she didn't know how to respond. The very neighborhood she had tried to dominate began to see her differently. Whispers turned into conversations, and other residents started discreetly sharing their own negative experiences. She was losing the street's perception, and she had no idea. But I didn't stop at documentation. I started planning more direct but clever countermeasures. The HOA's investigation gave me leverage. Complaints filed by her could now be countered with undeniable proof of harassment, making her actions riskier. Every attempt to intimidate me now carried potential consequences, not just for her reputation, but potentially for fines or disciplinary action from the HOA. My strategic patience was turning into a powerful weapon. Then the first real blow landed. One morning, I discovered her latest complaint dismissed entirely. The HOA had ruled in my favor, citing her repeated harassment and lack of credible evidence. It was more than a personal victory, it was public validation. Other neighbors began to whisper about the HOA showdown between us, curious to see how it would unfold. What she had underestimated was that persistence alone wasn't enough. Strategy, evidence, and calm defiance could overwhelm even the most obsessive aggressor. The dynamic on the street shifted. Where she had once intimidated everyone with relentless complaints, she now faced suspicion, scrutiny, and quiet judgment. Every action she took was observed with renewed attention, and the neighborhood watched silently as her confidence eroded. I had turned her own tactics against her. Obsession fueled by surveillance now worked to expose her extremism. By the end of the week, the stakes had risen even higher. It was no longer a private feud, it had become a public spectacle. The neighborhood was buzzing with anticipation, watching as the conflict escalated. And I knew the next phase would be decisive. The moment where she would either back down completely or attempt a reckless escalation that could finally expose her for everything she had done. The chessboard was set, the pieces in place, and the next moves would determine the outcome of a battle that had started with petty complaints and minor harassment. The war was no longer hidden. The tension had spilled into the open, and every neighbor now had a stake in the outcome. What came next would change the dynamics of the street forever, and it was only a matter of time before the first irreversible move was made. The fallout from the HOA meeting had rippled through the entire neighborhood. Word spread quickly, carried through whispered conversations, subtle glances, and discreet gatherings behind closed doors. The once untouchable Karen next door was no longer seen as a guardian of neighborhood standards but as a figure whose mask had begun to crack. Yet, instead of backing down, she did what people like her often do, she doubled down. Her obsession took on an entirely new form. She began patrolling the street in the early mornings, walking with forced confidence while scanning for anything she could twist into a violation. Her movements became frantic, her pace brisker, her focus razor sharp. It was almost as if she believed the sheer force of her persistence could reverse the tide that had turned against her. But all it did was deepen the hole she was already digging. Despite her efforts, the power she once wielded was no longer effective. Residents she used to intimidate now avoided her gaze or closed their doors when she passed. The HOA, once eager to enforce her complaints, now scrutinized every submission she made, looking for the obsessive undertones that had been exposed. Her influence was slipping, and she could feel it. The desperation was visible in every exaggerated movement, every frantic note she scribbled, every time she lingered near my property as if searching for something, anything, she could use. And that desperation became the opening for the next phase of my plan. With her increasingly erratic behavior, the cameras captured far more than before. Late-night visits to my yard. Attempts to measure shrub distances. Flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as she circled my property, muttering to herself in frustration. The footage painted a picture of someone unraveling under the pressure of losing control. I compiled it carefully, arranging the clips into a narrative that reflected her escalating instability. Every timestamp, every moment of intrusion, every documented act formed a powerful visual timeline of her descent. But the true shift came from the neighborhood itself. The quiet network of residents who had suffered under her rule began stepping forward. Some shared statements describing years of excessive complaints. Others provided written accounts of similar harassment they had endured. One elderly couple even revealed she had tried to force them out after accusing them of violating noise ordinances simply for having guests over. Their stories, collected and organized, became a collective testimony that added a deeper layer to the case building against her. With this growing body of evidence, I prepared a formal complaint, not just a response, but a detailed grievance that documented her long pattern of abuse, harassment, and manipulation within the community. It was thorough, precise, and unmistakably damning. When I submitted it, I knew it would be a decisive turning point. The HOA's reaction was immediate. They called for a special meeting, a rare occurrence reserved for serious concerns affecting the entire neighborhood. And this time, the subject of the meeting was not me, it was her. The news spread faster than I anticipated. Residents who had once kept silent were now curious, even eager, to see accountability finally take shape. The anticipation built like tension before a storm. She, oblivious to the full extent of what was coming, still marched around the neighborhood with an air of authority she no longer possessed. But beneath the facade, panic simmered. She could feel the shift, even if she didn't yet know why. The night before the meeting, the cameras captured her standing at the edge of my lawn for several minutes, staring in silence. Her posture was tense, her breathing heavy, her hands trembling slightly. It was the first time I had seen her without her characteristic arrogance. The footage revealed a person no longer in control but consumed by fear of losing everything she believed she owned: power, authority, reputation. And in that moment, I realized the battle had reached a breaking point. She was cornered, desperate, and unpredictable. What she would do next was impossible to predict, but it was clear that the meeting would either push her to face the consequences or drive her into one final, reckless attempt to regain control. Either way, the calm before the storm was fading. The neighborhood was bracing for impact. And I knew the next chapter of this unfolding war would be the most explosive one yet. The day of the special HOA meeting arrived with a heavy tension that settled across the entire neighborhood. It was as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for what everyone suspected would be the climax of the long brewing storm. Neighbors emerged from their homes in small clusters, walking toward the clubhouse with a mix of curiosity, relief, and quiet anticipation. For many of them, this moment had been years in the making. I walked in early, carrying the compiled evidence that had taken weeks of careful preparation. The room was already filling by the time I arrived. Faces I had only seen behind curtains or from across driveways were now openly present, no longer hiding in fear of her retaliation. The HOA board members sat stiffly at the front, their expressions somber but focused. They knew this was not a routine meeting, it was a reckoning. She arrived moments later, striding in with strained confidence. But the cracks showed immediately. Her posture wasn't as rigid as usual. Her eyes flickered nervously from face to face, scanning for allies she no longer had. The room didn't welcome her with the usual polite nods. Instead, people stepped aside, avoiding her gaze as if her presence itself repelled them. That subtle rejection was the first sign that her influence had finally crumbled. The meeting began formally, but the facade of politeness dissolved quickly. The board introduced the agenda, a review of multiple complaints filed against her, supported by evidence alleging harassment, abuse of HOA processes, and property violations of her own. The room shifted with quiet murmurs as the gravity of the situation sank in. For the first time, she wasn't the accuser, she was the one under investigation. My presentation came next. I didn't speak with anger or accusation. Everything unfolded in calm, structured narration. Security footage played on a small screen, her pacing my driveway at midnight, tampering with garden fixtures, peering into windows, measuring plants and fences with obsessive precision. Each clip landed like a blow. The board watched in stunned silence. Residents exchanged tense glances, witnessing the behavior they had always suspected but could never prove. I then presented the timeline of her actions, the patterns of targeting, the absurd volume of complaints, the escalating intrusions. The evidence spoke for itself. And when other residents stepped forward with their own accounts, the room transformed from quiet observation to collective accountability. Their stories aligned perfectly, painting a long history of intimidation that reached far beyond just my experience. As the testimonies unfolded, she sat rigidly in her chair, face draining of color. With every new statement, her carefully constructed image of authority dissolved. She attempted to interject a few times, but each attempt was met with calm reminders that she would have her chance to respond. And by the time that moment arrived, it was clear she had nothing left to defend. Her explanation was fragmented and rambling. She blamed misinterpretations, misunderstandings, even the HOA itself. But her words lacked the conviction they once held. The board listened, but their expressions made it clear that her narrative no longer held weight. She wasn't the victim she portrayed herself to be. She was the cause of the neighborhood's unrest. After hours of review, the HOA rendered its decision. In a formal but decisive statement, they announced that she would be removed from any role in enforcement activities, prohibited from filing unilateral complaints without board approval, and fined for multiple violations. But the final decision was the most impactful. She was issued an official notice of censure, an uncommon and serious penalty within the community rules. The impact was immediate. The power she had wielded for years evaporated in a single announcement. For the first time, she was the one held accountable. The room exhaled collectively, as though a weight had been lifted from the neighborhood itself. She stood abruptly and left without a word, but the cameras later showed her house dark and silent for days afterward. Her presence around the neighborhood diminished. No more late-night pacing. No more inspections. No more complaints. She had been defeated, not by aggression, but by truth, strategy, and the collective strength of those she once intimidated. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood gradually healed. Conversations returned to porches, laughter echoed across lawns, and the tension that once lingered like a shadow disappeared. My home finally felt like mine, safe, peaceful, and free from the constant scrutiny that had once defined my daily life. The war she started ended not in chaos, but in justice. And as I sat on my porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, I realized something profound. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply reclaiming the peace someone tried to steal.